to ask Andy to join me. Thank you very much for coming to talk to us tonight, Andy. I think the title of the talk is fascinating. It's like professional competence is something we're all very interested in, particularly how to take note of it and how to make it visible. So really looking forward to this. So probably have about 30 or so minutes talk, and then we'll go into a Q&A session. So if anyone's got questions, then please have a think, and we'll come to have a session at the end. And I think Gary's going to be helping me facilitate that session at the after Andy talked to us. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, Andy, for joining us tonight, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for the introduction, and thank you to the BCS Learning and Development Group for inviting me along tonight. So yeah, very much appreciated. I will share my screen, and as Kevin said, I'm Andy Rix. I'm Director of Growth and Development with the Electrotechnical Certification Scheme. We are ultimately a competency scheme looking at professional certification, professional competence, occupational frameworks, encouraging skills development in a number of forms. And ultimately, we develop a number of smart technology solutions to give better visibility on competence of the individual and at the workforce level. So what I'm going to run through this evening, firstly, I'll give you a bit of an introduction to what ECS is, how the standards are set, what governance looks like, and then some of the work that I did previously with BCS and a number of others across the sector for digital framework, just as an example of some of the work that we did to try and encourage upskilling of competence. Then I'm going to give an example from the building safety regulator, what's gone on post-Grenfell and why competence is important from a safety perspective, what the health and safety executive is looking at for anybody that's working within those environments. And I realise that won't be necessarily directly relevant to every individual on the call, but I think the principles are. And certainly in terms of what we're expecting to see, greater regulation of people that are working within buildings of any form, a lot of the principles will apply. So I'll run through that and what I'm involved in terms of some of the standard setting processes through that, and then have a look at smart technology solutions. So what we've done as a scheme and some of the work that I've done for the construction industry and CSCS, which is a particular scheme across wider construction, again, greater collaboration, greater visibility, and what that looks like. So ECS is a digital personnel certification scheme, but it is about the competence of the individual. So while there are a number of different schemes out there looking at the individual, looking at their qualifications, their health and safety, or environmental awareness experience, we've always taken the view of competence being skills, knowledge, experience, behaviours. For anybody that's involved in the academic world and development of those kind of SCEB statements are core to a lot of what's done now for the likes of apprenticeship, for national occupational standards, ultimately taking those building blocks together from an individual, all elements of that go together to make them competent to do their job, to do the role for which they've been employed or engaged. So ECS always takes that view of trying to build up both in terms of a physical plastic card that we still issue to people, but ultimately it's all a digital scheme, has been for 10 years, and it's about the standards that sit behind that. So the kind of things that we take into account and we look for to verify and to validate are things like apprenticeships, qualifications, certifications, different assessment types, as well as experience. So employment history, employer endorsements, and then ID verification technology into aspects like DBS, disclosure and barring service, for works on particular jobs, as well as minimum standards for health, safety, environmental awareness, potentially technical assessments as well for certain sectors. And then how's somebody keeping up to date with continuing professional development? How are they recording that? What are they doing in terms of their behaviours? How are they evidencing codes of professional practice? What are they doing for revalidation of skills as well? skills wane over time. So how are people keeping up to date? How are they refreshing and revalidating their knowledge and skills? And then how does this play in with things like professional memberships as well? So I'll go through some of that, in particular in terms of the digital sector and how we recognise organisations like BCS for that purpose as well. So just in terms of high-level numbers, we will do probably around 65,000 registrations this year, and we will run probably around 60,000 different assessment types. Vast majority of those run through an AI learning platform that we developed, alongside a number of solutions for employers and companies to manage their workforce. So altogether, that will cover now about 180,000 individuals in the UK, predominantly electricians, but far broader than that as well. I'll come on to kind of what we cover in terms of occupations. And then we've got about 5,000 employers that we deal with and use our systems, and vast majority of those are SMEs, micro businesses, but it's everybody then through to Amazon, the MOD, Ocado, local authorities, public bodies, etc. So huge scope there. And then we've got another platform for managing your supply chain. So if you think employer portal is about your own workforce as an employer, you've also got a system to look at your subcontractors if you have them. And that's ECS Check. So there's about 2,500 companies registered to that now. Altogether, we cover about 60% of the electrical market. And we are one of 38 schemes of a similar type that exist across the UK built environment. So that is all traditional craft occupations, builders, plumbers, carpenters, and then any electrotechnical schemes sit with ECS. And then as part of that building safety regulator piece, we're helping to develop at the moment 8 sector-specific competence frameworks. Ultimately, what does good look like for each sector in terms of career progression, entry into the industry, and then things like upskilling. Again, all focused on encouraging greater competency. So I mentioned electrical, which is still kind of the core of what we do. It's kind of where the scheme came from, best part of 60 years ago. But over the last 40, 50 years, it has expanded and now cover about 75 different occupations, about 220 different roles, different card types that exist within those occupations as well. So it is very complex. And this covers everything from fire and emergency security systems through to network infrastructure, datacoms cabling side, to telecoms, to cellular network field engineers, to building energy management systems, to digital suite as well. So that's digital support, network support systems, and digital cybersecurity, as well as things like audio visual, and then some engineering and related disciplines as well. So it is a very broad scheme in that sense. And the way in which the standards are set for that scheme it's not my decision on what good looks like for each occupation. It's up to industry. It's up to a mix of employers, associations, awarding organisations, training providers, and then employers large and small, including those that help develop some of the apprenticeship standards, some of the T levels, some of the work that I've done with partners here for the digital sector more broadly. Ultimately, it's trying to get consensus. What does good look like in terms of these frameworks, and that's what we do. So here's an example of some of the organisations that we work with across the digital group. Once they've developed an occupational framework, again, that I suppose career progression path. How do you get into this role, to this part of industry, and what does progression look like? What's good CPD? How do you get into management roles? How do you get into more advanced roles? That's then overseen by there's a technical evaluation group and a steering committee, and then ultimately there's oversight from for construction purposes, what's called Construction Leadership Council, and a number of licenses that we need to make. So that basically takes a broad view on how all schemes of this type should be raising the bar on competence and liaising with the relevant government departments to ensure that that is the recognised solution for whatever this part of industry is. So on terms of our steering committee, that includes the likes of the health and safety executive and the building safety regulator, both taking an active role as part of that oversight and governance, as well as institutions like the Institute of Engineering Technology, as well as some public sector charities, trade associations, etc. So in terms of building safety and competence, I realise that for some of the people on this call who think that this may not be relevant, but it is. And reason being that post-Grenfell, there was a review into safety, and the competence of the workforce was one of the areas that was highlighted as potential weakness that led to, along with a catalogue of other errors, omissions, and inadequacies in process, to the disaster that led to 72 people losing their lives. So what was done in terms of the regulators' views that they, as with the powers of the health and safety executive, set up an industry competence committee to advise on what good looks like in this area, as well as a number of other subcommittees and groups. And there is actually about 40 different working groups all looking at competency for more than 1,000 different occupations. The relevant one for me is working group 2, which is for those that install and predominantly focused on systems install. So think electrical, network infrastructure, and data comms cabling to telecom systems, etc. But the principles are interesting. So what this boils down to, over many, many hundreds of pages of recommendations and reports that came out for building safety, was 5 principles that for an organization working in these types of environment, there should be a certification process for the business, looking at organizational competency in whatever form. And there's some structures that have been out there for a number of years. And then from an individual perspective, there should be baseline competency. So apprenticeships were given as an example of, but ultimately this is about vocational or relevant certifications, qualifications at level 2 or 3, depending on the sector. But there should be training ultimately that leads to a baseline competency point. Skip over the middle point for now. There should then be a way to revalidate that skills, that knowledge over time, a way to refresh training. There should be a system for mandatory or recommended continuing professional development. And then for anybody that's working in those types of environments, there should be a minimum standard of awareness for things like fire safety, and particularly from the network support side. If you are working in an environment where, particularly for cabling purposes, you're going to disturb the compartment of the building, ultimately putting cables for walls or similar, you need to understand what other trades may need to do in terms of fire stopping. For fire safety purposes and compartmentation. And then there should be a way to verify all of that information for the individual. There should be a certification scheme, and CSCS or alliance members such as ECS were given as examples there. Indeed, ECS was highlighted in the first report as an exemplar in this area, where Dame Judith Hackett, Commissioner report, felt that was a particular strength for schemes. Absolutely needed to be improved, but set a good foundation for verification of individual competence. And one of the things that we do as a scheme is there's a minimum standard for health, safety, environmental awareness for anybody that's working across any built environment project. It's not just construction, but that does play a big part of it. And we've done this for many years. Probably going back 30 years or so, we've incorporated those elements on fire safety, quite high level, but good, I suppose, encompassing awareness for the impact that different roles, different trades have when working in those types of environments. And there's some free online training from the Construction Industry Training Board as well for that purpose. The output from a lot of this work and looking at competency is ultimately a a route to competence type diagram. I've given an example here from network infrastructure installation, datacomms cable. And you see lots of green boxes. I'm not expecting anybody to be able to read the detail on this. But ultimately, it identifies a number of routes into industry. That might be apprenticeships, that might be T-levels, that might be just experience. It might be people that build up experience over time and then may do some qualifications or may gain their competency in that informal manner, but need to have it assessed. And I've helped industry in this regard for network infrastructure as well to launch an experienced worker assessment, which is exactly that. It's about assessing competency that already exists, but people may need to evidence or may not be able to evidence. So that gets you to the point of baseline competency. There's then discussions of what does good like in terms of career progression. What does an advanced role look like for network infrastructure installation, or how do you get into management or design or similar? And we've been doing a lot of this for 55 years, but in this regard for about 10 years. So a lot of these areas were already in quite a good place in terms of those competence frameworks, and we've just been helping industry come together to codify, I suppose, a lot of that. So I realise that, as I say, some of that, or people say, well, building safety regulator applies to anybody that's working in high risk residential buildings. So they talk about 18 meters plus, 7 stories or above, hospitals under construction, care homes, construction, things like that. But actually, the building safety regulator has powers to enforce compliance in all buildings in England, not devolved nations, but that is their power. And certainly, direction of travel when looking at competence has not been to create a 2-tier system where competence that applies for somebody that's working in a high-risk residential building is higher than elsewhere. Ultimately, they want a system for competence that applies across, I'd say, the UK, depending on interrelation with other authorities and regulators from the developed nations, of course, but the principles are the same. So as an example of something that we were doing anyway with the digital sector as a whole, was looking at how we could encourage better skills development, how we could coordinate some of the routes in, some of that good career progression piece, the different certifications, the apprenticeships, the T-levels. There is a myriad of qualifications and training routes out there at different levels, with different scope, with different contexts. So how can we simplify some of the landscape around this? And we coordinated that group that I mentioned earlier, a mix of trade associations, providers, awarding organizations, employers, etc., and had a look at breaking this down into a number of disciplines, which we categorized into these 3 groups for digital support and development, networks, and digital security. And then what we were able to do is to start to build up these frameworks into what career progression looked like. So I mentioned things like T-levels and industry placements. Again, I was on the T-level group for digital support and some of the routes there. So it was helping to highlight how some of that could be of benefit, getting employers engaged, number of apprenticeships that exist now, lots of government funding available for apprenticeships now as well. So how do they play a part? And then with this sector, obviously a huge number of professional certifications that apply. So Cisco and Microsoft, etc. How do they tie into this picture, and how do you all reach the same route for that baseline competency that I talked about? Qualified and competent for your role. My view has always been there are lots of ways of achieving that outcome. It's about evidencing the relevant route through, but ultimately you meet a standard, you meet a standard. It shouldn't matter the route that you get there. It should be an objective process. And then once you've got there, what does that CPD piece look like? How can we assist with a recording that's quite often necessary for your professional memberships? And then for those people that are going on to different levels, different routes. As I mentioned, management as an example. Then how do they get into those roles? And again, what's necessary? What's good practice? What should the industry be recommending? So across those disciplines, and kind of what we did in the background as a group was start to map all of this out against the qualification levels in the UK. So you kind of move up from level 1, just being able to kind of follow, take instruction, through to those that qualify at level 2 and 3 that might be moving into assisting and then applying principles. How are people kind of reaching that state where they're able to work independently, through to, as I say, the higher level skills for strategy development or ensuring compliance in different areas. And again, with things like Sphere framework, again, thinking about how this all mapped in. So what we do in terms of ECS is ultimately color code the cards and the visual representation out of those standards, so that people and employers and clients know where people fit within that roadmap. And ultimately a gold card there being somebody that's undertaken the relevant standard. I use that in an academic sense, being the current industry employer defined requirements for skills, knowledge, experience, behaviors, which quite often is the outcome from an apprenticeship, say. But again, different ways to get there. And then how do you include things like RRT Tech or ICT Tech as professional accreditations as well? CompTIA were very helpful during this process as trade association and provider as well of a number of certifications with that mapping process. So we were able to go through, compare what could look like in different areas, from network and cloud to IT management to data and development, etc., and then map that across levels. So in that sense, we were starting to be able to give employers, clients, and ultimately any end user an understanding of what this route meant at what level, and again starting to define what the expectations were on individuals to do X, Y, Z, and ultimately what the limits of their competency are as well. So that also aligns with titles and outcomes from the likes of Microsoft certified programs. Again, give that as an example of where does novice, associate, professional, expert, in terms of their certifications, tie in. Many hundreds of routes here, from the formal qualifications and the apprenticeships to the certifications. Quite a complex process, but ultimately trying to give a bit of simplicity and a bit of credence to those different routes that apply. So while that process I think was a particularly beneficial one, and indeed we over the last kind of couple of years have had probably 400 people or so that have certified down those routes, which is great. I mean, we cover 180,000 people, so we were never intending this to be the area which we saw hundreds of thousands of people, but it sets a good standard. And I think if it can give better visibility to that system and it raises competence, then it meets our objectives as a non-profit organization. That's what we want to do, is try and support the industry on that ambition, and ultimately more checking. So when I talk about workforce management solutions, and I'll come to, I suppose, some of the verification processes that apply, and again, why that's relevant. So I started off earlier talking about the employer portal, and this is a solution for companies to manage their workforce. Ultimately, what it's doing is giving visibility to the company in terms of people's different apprenticeships, qualifications, certifications. It does allow them to apply for cards, to undertake technical assessments. But to me, the most important thing is using it as a bit of a skills matrix of assessing where the workforce is, getting that oversight, and ultimately putting a plan in place for where there may be skills deficiencies. Yes, if people want to apply for cards, fantastic. If they want to undertake some of the technical assessments we run, fantastic. not going to stop them from doing that at all. But it's almost not the most important thing for me. The most important thing is about getting that visibility, because once people and once companies and employers know what that is, I think quite often it helps to guide what the next step should be for taking competency as a whole for the workforce. So we highlight things like expiration of certain certificates. We can give guidance in terms of what career progression may look like for individuals. And that is a free to access system. So anybody that's interested, please go to the ECS Card website, ecscard.org.uk. You can apply online and get access to that system for free. The add-on to that is ECS Check. So Employer Portal is for your workforce, ECS Check is for your supply chain. And where this has been particularly, I suppose, useful or interesting is particularly with public bodies, where taxpayers' money is being spent on a project, say, and perhaps they've given a contract out for, let's say it is there was, I remember, a local authority that was doing a town hall project, and they gave that to a very large main contractor for the building industry. They subcontracted work out to a large mechanical and electrical contractor. They subbed work out to specialist contractors for network infrastructure, for electrical, for a number of other areas to get this building operational. They sub that out to a number of self-employed individuals, and ultimately client asked the question that they didn't know who was on their project. They didn't know what the competencies were. They didn't know what the risks were, and came to us, wanted a solution to help to give that visibility. So that's what ECS Check is. It's a solution that looks project by project, using the database that we already have, using the 5,000 kind of employers that already had accounts to manage their workforce that going on to particular projects. And what that then means is that from a client perspective, and for your supply chain, if you're subcontracting out particular elements of work, then you can see who's going to be on the project ahead of time, what their skills, knowledge, experience, behavior looks like, as well as what the workforce mix looks like. Have you got the right mix between network engineers and cybersecurity specialists, say, or have you got the right number of qualified personnel or management personnel, supervisory personnel to apprentices, trainees, those that don't perhaps have the necessary experience. And then when you know ahead of time who's going to be on that project, who's going to be working in that place, you can also audit it. So it ties into a smartphone app so that you can ensure that those people that turn up are the people you're expecting, and again, meet whatever requirements you set in terms of ratios, numbers, etc. We then provide, as part of the reporting functions out of that, measures on things like social value. Did you employ people from the local area? Does that help the social value requirements for a public project by having local apprentices? Is that giving back to the community? Are they undertaking the relevant skills? How is that project helping? So, and that includes a number of different splits in terms of age and sex as well, to encourage, particularly for some of the areas of construction, or women into construction and STEM subjects as well. The other element to this is that it's quite often a requirement for certain occupations, certain work. So in Northern Ireland, this is a license to practice requirement for electrical, for example, electrical installation, but it also ties into a number of good employment charters and practices. It's all done in real time. So all the access on a project on that workforce is directly into the database. So with relevant security measures, all on a permissions-based access process, but does give the employer and the client's ability to manage that all in real time, and that auditor the same. Things change. DBS, I mentioned earlier, Disclosure and Barring Service, what used to be CRB, perfect example, relevant at the point in time that it's done. I think of this in a similar way for competence and skill certification. people obviously do lots of CPD that's ongoing. There is a requirement to revalidate, refresh. So people should be checking regularly. In the same vein, though, if when we're verifying qualifications, and we verify directly into the databases of awarding organisations and similar, but very occasionally you might find out there's been fraudulent behaviour for whatever reason, you can cancel that instantly as well. So I always encourage people to use the technology systems that are there. And this has been set up as a solution to manage as many projects as you like across the UK, and provide a very simple way to identify workforce that will be on these projects. And that includes lots of local authority projects, NHS, transport, through to like data centres as well. Obviously, anywhere that's got a particular high security concern or a need to evidence competency requirements, this may come into play. And then, I say covering a huge number of companies now, lots of known names on there, I'm sure, but accounts for about organisations with combined £30 billion of revenue in the UK. So some very sizable companies that are now starting to pay attention to what they're doing in terms of their, I suppose, their own workforce, but also their supply chain. The kind of last element I wanted to pick up on in terms of smart technology integration, and I would say a good example of collaboration is a group that I led for CSCS. CSCS is the Construction Skills Certification Scheme. They cover about 1.4 million people in the UK, and they are ultimately a licensor for a logo that 38 of our schemes ultimately sign up to and collaborate on. And this is a process and a project called CSCS Smart Check. Ultimately, between the 38 organisations you see, they're all kind of operating across the built environment, all separate organisations covering 1,000+ occupations. And this is everything from, I mentioned, plumbers, welders, industrial paint applications specialists, glazers, and everything else in between, including electrotechnical for ECS. And all had their own different solutions, systems, etc. And when we were encouraging people to verify the workforce, what it meant is quite often people didn't know what system to use. Some kind of physical cards, some virtual cards, some contactless devices, some near-field communication, some with QR codes and virtual cards and dynamic QR codes versus static codes, some with no smart technology solutions at all. Ultimately, what it meant is that people weren't undertaking checks. So we were given a challenge, I suppose, for particularly projects in the built environment, predominantly construction, but applies elsewhere, of how can we put in place a process to verify all 2.1 million of those people that work in the UK currently in these roles, in these schemes, so that there's one simple process that ultimately improves standards, productivity, and safety. That's what we want to do, is give that visibility on competence. So this was launched in April 2022, and it was initially launched as an app. So available in App Store, Google Play Store. And what that does in very simple terms is set up a number of APIs, a number of application programming interfaces into the databases of those 38 organizations to verify anybody that presents themselves for work on a project can now be checked of, are they, firstly, who they say they are, but also are they competent, qualified to do the role that they've been engaged to do? What's their skills, their knowledge, experience, behaviors? How are you evidencing this? And that launched 2022, got very good traction, actually, more so than we were expecting. Starting to get, at the end of last year, 25,000, 30,000 checks a month, which is great. And it was the first step in terms of that process for particularly sites that don't have any systems in place, didn't have hard infrastructure, things like security gates set up. But what about the big projects? What about the nuclear power stations? What about the likes of HS2 and those types of projects? Well, they've already got that set up. They've already got those solutions in place. They're not going to use a smartphone app to do this. They've got an IT provider that's already doing this. we knew that there would need to be a period of transition for inclusion into those processes as well. So that's what we did. That launched in May this year. So we've now integrated that process and that technology with 70 IT partners, including some of the largest for onboarding and access control in the UK. And what that's meant is that we've gone from 25,000 to 30,000 people being checked per month to over 2 million being checked per month as of May. For ECS, we're getting 30,000 plus people that are being checked a month now. So an incredible uptake. And what that means is it's becoming more important than ever to, one, be able to identify who you are. In terms of ID verification checks, always an essential part, particularly with things like modern slavery that do still obviously go on in a number of areas. But also, and I think fundamentally, in terms of that competence piece, is somebody qualified and competent for the role that they're doing? Because now there are more ways to check this than ever before. And I will focus on projects like data centers because this comes up a lot. High security clients, employers need to know exactly who's coming on, exactly what their skill set is, and possibly probably where they are, what they're doing, and do they have that process in place for oversight. So if you're going to be working on any of those types of environments, this will certainly be a question that comes up, I think, going forward. As I say, huge increases that have already been seen this year. And that then means we can do a lot more in terms of labour market intelligence, in terms of evaluating the skills deficiencies, skills gaps for the UK, working collaboratively with industry and government to then do something about that, hopefully, be that encourage more people to upskill or to look at potentially other routes to meet the labour demand for the foreseeable future. So just to kind of finish off, I would say this, of course, but what are the benefits in terms of kind of personnel certification schemes and what we look at competency? Well, in terms of from an employer's perspective, you look at qualification verification, onboarding processes, it makes that a lot easier. Ultimately, you're trying to simplify as much of that as possible. We want people to get into work quickly. We want to avoid that red tape and burden that sits on employers. So it should improve hiring decisions. It should reduce the risk of liability for organizations that have done those checks. Also means they can comply with more industry standards and get that access as quick as possible, particularly for any of those more regulated environments. It also enhances workforce management. So as I said, there are systems now for employers to take that more holistic view of what the needs of the industry are. Where are the skills gaps? What do they need to do in terms of providing more training or different resources, bringing new people in to supplement that? That, in turn, improves reputation and competitiveness, should encourage productivity, streamlines audits, improves accreditation. Ultimately, what we all want to do, which is encourage more skills development, improve competency, contribute to workforce development. So thank you very much for your time and for listening through that. I hope that's been of benefit and interest. More than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Andy. Not sure if my network's working okay, but I've listed a whole page of questions as I went. First of all, did you mention CPD recording? How the whole area of sort of continual monitoring? How do you track people once they've been given a card? And what do you do to revoke if somebody doesn't keep up the standards? Because
Sure.
obviously that's a big issue with sort of professional competence and tied to that is it also aligned with professional body standards? You talked about RIT Tech and sort of, but CITP or CEng, or has it gone up to the higher levels of qualifications?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of CPD recording system, Ultimately, it is a way for individuals to record the CPD that they do, and if we can verify it, we will. But quite often there might be, CPD of course takes lots of different forms. It might be formal qualifications, certifications. It could be seminars and sessions like this. It could be reading relevant materials from that body. Obviously, BCS puts out lots of good reading materials, which might be CPD in and of itself. So not all CPD that we have in there will be verifiable. And not all CPD is mandatory. So it is up to each sector to decide what is mandatory in terms of the relevant standards versus what might be good practice. And at the moment, this is one of the most hotly debated topics across all of those groups, and I think wider UK as well. We've never taken the view that a set number of hours or points is needed. It more likely falls into categories where a particular, say, regulation has been updated, maybe a British standards that applies, and therefore from a point in time, that becomes the mandated CPD. So there are a few occupations that applies. There are a few, so electrical, and that's the case. The wiring regulations, British Standards 7671, you have to meet the latest edition of. Other areas such as network infrastructure installation, there are certifications that themselves require renewal. We will be looking for to introduce a system on that looks at knowledge revalidation, but it won't necessarily mandate any particular CPD, just gives visibility of the CPD. Because ultimately, we don't want to be in a position to tell industry what they have to do and what employers or individuals have to do. It should be up to industry to decide. And as you say, Kevin, there are already a number of professional organisations that will require that. So where we can verify memberships via, say, Electrotech, then we do. And that itself should encourage that. So it's a bit like touch in areas.
Yeah.
The other question that you ask in terms of
partially relying, so you're partially relying on professional bodies and their process as well as your own.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. We will work with and in some areas rely on other structures already in place. We're not looking to duplicate, replicate anything. But also there are some occupations that I listed across the kind of 75 that, to be honest, not at that place. They are not ready to have that conversation because the parts of industry are too new. It maybe hasn't existed in terms of culture, it hasn't existed in terms of formal structures or infrastructure to deliver some of it. So it's probably too early to be having a lot of that conversation, again, in our view. So what we talk about across a number of occupations is what happens over the next 10, 15 years, not the next 10, 15 months, unfortunately. Bit of reality. The engineering council status, yes, we do recognise elements of that as well. We try to recognise a number of academic and professional routes, but that should always sit ideally on top of competency in the occupation. And again, getting into some of the granular of those processes, I don't think that always necessarily aligns. And this is where you're getting into routes that are based solely on, say, maybe a professional discussion rather than additional methods of assessment as well. So that's where we might differ from some structures.
Yeah. Question from Susan. Is the card physical or has it a digital card with QR codes? I think you were showing the QR code. But you also got the physical cards as well.
Correct. So it's both.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we have a My ECS app that individuals can download that provides a dynamic QR code. So something that is used for a one-time read only in the relevant systems. That ties into CSCS Smart Check, that ties into our own app called ECS Check, and that ties into ultimately those feeds. So yes, the individual can use that virtual system. I encourage them to use the virtual system, but we also provide a plastic card. We've surveyed people a few times on this. They like having something physical that sits alongside the digital record. And indeed, there will be some environments, some projects where they may not be able to take a smartphone. So just having something that can still be checked, can still be verified is quite useful. Nuclear power stations is one that's come up a few times.
Yeah, yeah. A question I had. You mentioned Sophia, but it looks like you're working quite low level in Sophia. Sort of building task-orientated networking type orientation. You had a lot of cyber roles there. There's the UK Cybersecurity Council, for example, has established a lot of competencies. Are you working with organisations like that are defining new standards for competence?
Yeah, so we started doing this in about 2021 for Digital 2022. Yes, had those conversations as well with the Cybersecurity Council in terms of which was at the time the 13 competencies that they had and how that played in. So that goes into a much deeper level of each of those roles. Ours is certainly taking a higher level view of to give the oversight, but it does align, and that was always the intention. Again, certainly not looking to for that industry group to redefine anything that had already been done, but it should or complement. That's the idea.
Yeah. Thank you. It's a question about just about management level is always seen as sort of the highest level you can achieve. That was quite sort of called out in your diagram, sort of as you become competent and then you become a manager. I think a lot of us around BCS think that that's not necessarily the case. I call myself a professional technologist and a professional manager. They're different disciplines.
Yeah, absolutely. There are occupations which go up to level 7. There's nothing at level 8 that I can think of in the system. We've got about 2,500 qualifications that we deal with. I'm going to go out on a limb and say 7 is the highest, but yeah, absolutely. There is nothing to prevent that. Management is always seen as an RQF minimum level 4, but there are obviously lots of roles that are higher than that. Doesn't mean that one is necessarily superior to the other. It's just the kind of tradition for a number of areas in terms of where they have gone. But dealing with, we've got essentially about a dozen different kind of groups that look at this. Majority work that way. Not all. Network infrastructure is a good example of where people go into network engineering and then into support and then on. And yeah, there are some good level 6, 7 routes there as well. Absolutely to that point.
Yeah. I'm scanning through the questions we've got online as well as my own questions. I don't want to hog all the questions, but where you started I've done quite a lot with ISO 24773. Is it a sort of definition for sort of skills and competence? Is that a reference point for you as well when building this?
It's not, although collectively we have reviewed the ISO, I was going to say the 27,000 series a few times, the 22,000, the 24,000. They never quite fit for purpose, but there are a lot of good principles in there that I could absolutely encourage. Tend to look at the moment at the British Standard 8670 for individual competence as being a a good example of, but the principles are widely the same and do overlap.
Yeah, it does all feel very familiar. I sit on a couple of about 5 trailblazer groups, and it's all the same principles that IFA are implementing. For the first time, it actually sounds like things are joining up, rather than different people doing different things. We just, well, what could we all do as sort of learning development specialists in helping support and promote this more widely? Because it sounds like you've got absolutely excellent practice going on, in particularly around the building industry, but we should be doing this across the whole of industry.
Yeah. And I suppose that was one of the reasons I started looking at kind of the digital sector and coverage about 4 or 5 years ago was we were getting more and more requests for this from employers that were operating in these regulated environments, and those that were in a position to enforce standards, or the clients knew what we did already, wanted a simple solution that could work across a wider workforce. So that was kind of why we went down that route. But it is not as always something that is written in stone. It should evolve, it should change, it should update. So absolutely, you've already given me some good points to be able to adjust some of the online materials. Is how do we keep that relevant and up to date? How does it fit the reality of what really goes on? And yeah, give us that feedback. As I say, we're a non-profit organisation, so we fortunately have the ability to do a lot of that work where we can see the value and where we can see the coming together collectively and to collaborate in that area. I do think that is something that we've done very well across about 200 different organisations, particularly associations and professional bodies that help set these standards. Brilliant. Let's see if we can do more and as you say, raise standards across the piece.
Yeah. Well, we're pretty much at time. I would say thank you very much for that, Andy. That has been fascinating, and it's really nice to hear some things that are successful, that are gaining traction in industry and actually really helping promote competence in a variety of sectors. So really,
is the time for another couple of questions, Kevin?
Yeah. If you're quick, Gary, go on.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned, about reflecting the reality of what goes on, Andy. So I'm going to paint a little bit of the negative picture and see how you're dealing with that then. Stephen makes the point, it's easier for a bad accountant or HR officer to become CIO than a good technology expert. And we've all come across that in our career. That the decision makers are not really competent to make the technical decisions. So, the feeling there is that there's one rule for one and one rule for the other, that it's all about workforce management, but not about the top level. So do you have anything in place there to try and address that?
I suppose the point that you're making about who is responsible, who is making that decision in terms of workforce, that may well be the CIO or CEO, etc. So how do you ensure that they are competent to do that role? Well, that's more organizational competency, I would say, more than workforce. So probably a different process. But yeah, I think absolutely two sides of a coin there, that there should be the processes in place so that the organization as a whole is competent to undertake the task, again, whatever that role may be, as well as the people. And that does mean that, and I do think actually that probably some processes have started to change in this regard as well, in terms of oversight. Building safety, as an example, holding directors or CEOs directly to account for financial or criminal sanctions if they are negligent. I can see a kind of wind of change there, maybe a little, but nothing I can necessarily help with directly in that regard.
Okay, and one more that was in comments is James asked, what interoperability is available between ECS solution and other solutions to recognise certifications? And I think the point there is that there are so many competence frameworks to choose from. So what's in place to ensure cohesion, between vocational training qualifications, other frameworks like Sophia, apprenticeships, all of which have got different refresh cycles and different update timings, etc., etc. So is there anything in place to make sure everything hangs together?
So, as I mentioned, the groups are not meant to be task and finish groups. They are meant to be those that are taking an industry-wide view and continue. And BCS was part of that, and was very helpful in terms of the initial development. I think it is absolutely an area that does need a refresh and review. It's one of those that we will be looking at again next year. And in terms of, I suppose, interoperability in terms of technology, yes, because we operate dozens of kind of APIs into different organizations, predominantly the likes of awarding organizations, certification bodies, but could be done wider to try and automate as much of that as possible. But in terms of the standard, then yeah, by all means, I would say anybody that has an interest, please do reach out. I'm more than happy to get them involved. All those groups are open access ultimately. I think that is something that we've done a little bit differently to others because, as you say, there are unfortunately at times kind of different competing views. Is that it's not limited in size and scope. Lots of companies that do get involved are quite small, as well as those that do happen to sit on the trailblazer groups and have been involved in kind of some of the more formal processes, but it's always by consensus. All the views welcome.
Okay, and I think final question from me then, Andy, is how do we find out more?
Sure. So all the information is on our website, which is ecscard.org.uk. I'm quite happy as well for yourself, Kevin, to send out maybe with recording my contact information. So if people do want to find out more, get in touch with me directly, and I'm more than happy to have those conversations.
Yeah, thank you.